May 1916, the British Grand Fleet sailed into the North Sea to fight the ultimate naval engagement of the First World War. The Battle of Jutland was the colossal clash of steel leviathans the world had been anticipating for a decade. It was, by definition, a battle of dreadnoughts. But the warship that had given her name to this entire era of naval warfare was not there. As the battle lines engaged, HMS Dreadnought was sitting quietly in dry dock at Portsmouth, undergoing a refit that ran from April into June 1916. She would never fire her main armament at an enemy capital ship. Yet, her absence from the greatest surface action of her time is only the second most ironic fact of her existence. The first is what her creation actually achieved. When the Royal Navy designed Dreadnought, the goal was to produce a machine of such terrifying superiority that no rival nation would dare challenge British command of the sea. Instead, by resetting the standard, Britain reduced the relative value of its unmatched older battleship advantage and gave Imperial Germany an opportunity to concentrate future construction on the same revolutionary type. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Royal Navy measured its global supremacy in rows of steel. The standard British battleship was an imposing fortress, armed with a mixed battery of weapons. A typical British vessel carried 4 heavy 12-inch guns in 2 main turrets, backed by a mixed secondary battery that varied by class, often including 9.2-inch or 6-inch weapons distributed along the sides. The prevailing tactical doctrine was simple: close the distance with the enemy and smother them with an overwhelming volume of rapid fire from every weapon available. It was a doctrine shaped by expectations of combat at relatively short ranges, often only a few thousand yards. But a new underwater weapon was rapidly changing the geometry of naval warfare. By the early 1900s, the self-propelled torpedo was becoming faster, more reliable, and capable of traveling further than ever before. Naval theorists realized that if a battleship sailed within 3,000 or 4,000 yards of an enemy fleet, it risked being gutted below the waterline by a torpedo swarm. Torpedoes therefore added another powerful incentive to fight from greater distances, while improved optics and fire control methods encouraged some officers to imagine battle lines opening fire at 6,000 or 7,000 yards or farther. At that new distance, the old method of independent, rapid fire completely collapsed. When a gun was fired at a target 4 miles away, the crew could not simply point and shoot. A gunnery officer, stationed high in the ship's mast, had to watch through optics to see where the shell landed. By observing the massive column of water thrown up by a missed shot, the splash, the spotter could calculate the error and order the gunners to adjust their elevation. But a physical reality of the sea stood in their way. At long range, especially through smoke, haze, and a disturbed sea, the splash generated by a 9.2-inch shell could be extremely difficult to distinguish from the splash of a heavy 12-inch shell. When a mixed battery battleship opened fire with all its guns, the sea around the enemy's ship instantly erupted into a chaotic forest of water columns and smoke. The spotter, high in the mast, was blinded by the interference. He had no way of knowing which gun had caused which splash. If he could not identify the shell, he could not correct the aim. The very secondary weapons, intended to destroy the enemy, could therefore interfere with the corrections needed to bring the ship's heaviest guns accurately onto the target. Furthermore, at these extended ranges, intermediate guns became far less dependable against the thickest sections of battleship armor. They could still tear through lighter protection, wreck exposed positions, and start fires, but their ability to deliver a decisive blow against the enemy's armored core declined sharply. The standard battleship of the era was carrying hundreds of tons of secondary weapons that complicated its own spotting while contributing less to the destruction of a heavily protected capital ship. The gunnery crisis forced a radical conclusion. The most compelling solution was to build a ship whose offensive power rested on one uniform caliber of heavy gun. If a ship fired 4, 6, or 8 12-inch guns simultaneously in a coordinated salvo, The resulting cluster of splashes would all definitively belong to the main battery. The spotter could track them, adjust the range, and systematically walk the heavy, armor-piercing shells onto the target. The physical laws of gunnery had reset the board. The world's largest fleet of battleships now faced the possibility of being badly outclassed in the decisive fleet action of the next war, even though its older ships would remain useful for bombardment, escort, and secondary operations. To its advocates, the logic of the all-big-gun warship was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. Turning that theory into a real ship, however, required a champion with the authority to force it through the Admiralty. Admiral Sir John Jacky Fisher arrived at the Admiralty in October 1904 as the newly appointed First Sea Lord. He did not come to comfortably manage the Royal Navy. He came to violently drag it into the 20th century. Fisher was a polarizing, uncompromising force of nature, a man who famously believed that the essence of war was violence and that moderation was an imbecility. He possessed an obsessive, driving vision for the future of naval combat, and after years of climbing the ranks, he had finally secured the absolute authority required to execute it. The idea of a uniform, all-big-gun warship was not Fisher's personal invention. In fact, the conceptual framework for such a vessel was already circulating through the world's naval ministries. In 1903, an Italian naval architect named Vittorio Cuniberti published a provocative article in the authoritative naval annual, Jane's Fighting Ships. Usually rendered in English under titles such as An Ideal Battleship for the British Fleet, the piece outlined a colossal vessel armed exclusively with 12 12-inch guns, protected by thick armor, and capable of tremendous speed. Cuniberti was a theorist, and his own government had initially declined to build his design. Yet his proposal demonstrated that the all-big-gun ship was a technological inevitability. Across the Atlantic, the United States Navy was already drafting the South Carolina class, an all-big-gun concept of their own. But recognizing an inevitability and actually funding it were two very different things. Other nations debated, hesitated, and struggled with sluggish procurement boards and budget constraints. He officially committed the Royal Navy to the new doctrine of long-range salvo fire and demanded a capital ship that abandoned the traditional mixed-calibre broadside entirely. But Fisher's strategic vision required more than just heavy artillery. To fight an enemy at 7,000 yards, a warship first had to force the enemy to stay at that distance. If a hostile ship was faster, it could simply choose to run away, or, conversely, close the range to unleash a swarm of torpedoes. Therefore, Fisher's new battleship required a massive leap in operational speed. He set an unyielding requirement, a sustained top speed of 21 knots. This was 3 full knots faster than the standard battleships of the era. Combined with unprecedented firepower, that speed was intended to dictate the terms of an engagement and demoralize rival powers before the hull even touched the water. Fisher had forged the tactical doctrine into a rigid requirement. To turn it into a workable design while protecting it from traditionalist attack, he needed technical authority and institutional cover. After preliminary design work began in late 1904, Fisher formally convened the specially selected Committee on Designs in January 1905, giving an official Admiralty body a tightly focused mandate to examine the new battleship and armored cruiser concepts. Ostensibly, the committee was formed to investigate the future of warship construction and advise the Admiralty on new technologies. In practice, the committee examined competing arrangements of guns, armor, machinery, and hull form within the broad direction Fisher had already set, while giving his program the authority of a formidable expert consensus that politicians would find difficult to dismiss. But not everyone was silenced by Fisher's political maneuvering. Admiral Lord Charles Beresford emerged as the fiercest critic of the new doctrine, and his opposition was rooted in a terrifying, mathematically sound reality. By some contemporary measures, the Royal Navy possessed a traditional battleship advantage approaching 3-to-1 over the Imperial German Navy, although the ratio depended on which completed, building, and still effective ships were counted. Beresford warned that the new standard would reduce the relevance of this accumulated lead and let Germany concentrate future construction on the same type, even as Britain retained major advantages in shipyards, finance, trained manpower, and global naval infrastructure. It was a colossal geopolitical gamble. Fisher's answer was that delay carried the greater danger. If an all-big gun ship was likely to appear somewhere, he believed Britain had to build it first and exploit the Royal Navy's industrial head start. The strategic requirement was formally approved. With the political battles fought, the theoretical parameters had to be forged into physical steel. This is where the first Sea Lord's role ended, and the naval architect's job began. Demanding a ship that carried 10 12-inch guns at 21 knots was an act of doctrine. Calculating the immense weight of the armored barbettes, ensuring the hull possessed enough buoyancy, and balancing the vessel so it did not capsize in rough seas was an act of engineering. That monumental task fell to Sir Philip Watts, the director of naval construction, and his highly capable assistant, J.H. Narbeth. Working under intense pressure, Narbeth played a major role in preparing the conceptual layouts, but the design emerged from the collective work of Sir Philip Watts, the director of Naval Construction's department, and the Admiralty officers reviewing each successive scheme. Mounting 4 heavy guns on a battleship was standard practice. Arranging 10 massive 12-inch guns, each housed in a heavily armored rotating turret, imposed severe demands on displacement, structural strength, and vertical weight distribution. Narbeth had to mathematically map the complex geometry of armor belts, deep ammunition magazines, and weight distribution, meticulously refining the options until he delivered the exact structural synthesis the Admiralty required. The strategic vision had been approved and the hull form drafted. The remaining problem was propulsion. Carrying 10 12-inch guns at a sustained 21 knots required machinery never before tested on a capital ship of this magnitude. Up to this point, the world's navies relied on massive reciprocating steam engines. These engines utilized towering mechanical pistons that furiously pumped up and down to turn a ship's propellers. While reliable and well understood, reciprocating engines could produce heavy vibration when driven at sustained high power. On a vessel designed around long-range gunnery, that vibration risked degrading the performance of rangefinders, sights, and observers at precisely the moment accuracy mattered most. It did not make gunnery impossible, but it added another source of error to an already difficult problem. The solution lay in the steam turbine pioneered by the British engineer Sir Charles Parsons. It forced high-pressure steam through closely packed metal blades, spinning a central shaft continuously in one direction. The system promised the sustained speed Fisher required, with far less vibration at high power, but at the cost of heavy fuel consumption at low speeds and the risk of installing experimental machinery on an unprecedented scale. No nation had ever propelled a massive capital ship with turbines. The Committee on Designs gambled on Parsons' machinery, permanently cementing the vessel's strategic speed. With the engine secured, Watts and his assistant J.H. Narbeth had to position the 5 heavy gun turrets. Across the Atlantic, American designers working on the South Carolina class were developing super-firing turrets, stacking one turret physically higher than another so it could fire directly over the roof of the one below. The British Admiralty distrusted the concept, fearing that blast from the upper guns could drive through the exposed sighting hoods of the lower turret and injure or disable the personnel stationed beneath them. Instead, Watts chose a flatter arrangement. He placed one turret forward, 2 on the centerline aft, and 2 spread out on the sides of the hull, known as wing turrets. The advantage was that all 10 guns were securely mounted without vertical stacking. The trade-off was a normal broadside of only 8 guns, the forward turret, both after turrets, and the wing turret on the engaged side, Cross-deck fire by the opposite wing turret was restricted to narrow angles and risked damaging the wooden deck, exposed fittings, and superstructure. Furthermore, every ton of steel dedicated to heavy guns and massive turbines had to be paid for elsewhere. To keep the ship's weight manageable and its main armor belt thick, the designers deliberately stripped away the medium-caliber secondary guns entirely. To defend against torpedo boats, they mounted an array of tiny, lightweight 12-pounder guns scattered across the superstructure. The advantage was a massive savings in weight. The trade-off was a built-in vulnerability. The 12-pounders would soon prove inadequate against newer destroyers that were becoming larger, faster, and harder to stop before they reached an effective torpedo launching position. Finally, the new speeds of modern naval combat forced a radical change in human geometry. For centuries, Royal Navy tradition dictated that the captain and officers lived in the stern of the ship, while the enlisted sailors slept forward. But in a fast-moving long-range battle, a captain could not afford to wait while his officers ran 400 feet up the deck to reach the command tower. Watts relocated the officers' quarters forward, directly beneath the bridge. The operational advantage was immediate command efficiency. The trade-off was daily misery. The officers now lived close to noisy auxiliary machinery beneath the bridge, while many enlisted sailors were shifted into unfamiliar quarters toward the stern. The reversal disturbed long-established routines, even though the turbine machinery aft was smoother than the reciprocating engines it replaced. The final blueprint was a formidable, highly compromised machine. But a blueprint sitting on a desk in London could not intimidate the German Empire. To secure Britain's dominance and shock the world, Admiral Fisher needed the design built faster than any rival nation thought industrially possible. When the keel of HMS Dreadnought was laid down at HM Dockyard, Portsmouth, on October 2, 1905, the Admiralty faced an immense industrial challenge. Admiral Fisher demanded that the largest, most technologically ambitious warship yet built for the Royal Navy be ready to begin trials roughly 1 year after her keel was laid, a timetable far more aggressive than normal completion and commissioning schedules. A standard battleship of the era typically took 3 to 4 years to construct. To finish this radical new Leviathan in just 12 months required an apparently impossible leap in British shipbuilding capability. The answer was that Fisher's famous 1-year build was as much a manufactured geopolitical weapon as it was an industrial miracle. The first Sea Lord understood that a revolutionary blueprint was only half the battle. If Britain slowly constructed the ship over 3 years, rival navies would have time to study, adapt, and build their own competing designs. But if the Royal Navy could suddenly present a finished, fully operational warship out of nowhere, it would strike a paralyzing psychological blow to the German Empire and the rest of the world. To achieve this shock, Fisher and the Admiralty prepared the construction schedule before the keel was laid, ordering critical components early and concentrating exceptional labor on the project. The primary bottleneck in building any capital ship was the main armament. Forging a massive 12-inch gun barrel required months of precise machining, heat treatment, and miles of high-tensile wire winding. The immense gun tubes and their heavily armored turrets were the longest lead time items in naval procurement. If Portsmouth had to wait for 10 new guns to be forged from scratch, the 1-year deadline would be mathematically impossible. Fisher solved this problem with ruthless efficiency. The Royal Navy already had 2 older-style mixed-battery battleships, the Lord Nelson class, currently under construction in other shipyards. Dreadnought was given overwhelming procurement priority. Older accounts claimed that guns or mountings intended for the Lord Nelson class were diverted directly to Portsmouth, while later examinations of the ordering records argue that her mountings were separately ordered and advanced through production ahead of competing work. The immediate advantage was securing the record-breaking construction timeline. The trade-off was that Dreadnought's extraordinary priority disrupted other programs, and the two Lord Nelson-class ships were not completed until 1908, although the extent to which their delay resulted from direct armament diversion remains disputed. With the guns secured, Portsmouth Dockyard was pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. A labor force of 3,000 men was assigned to the hull. They worked staggering 69-hour weeks in grueling, often dangerous conditions, driving thousands of rivets into the steel plates under the constant pressure of Admiralty deadlines. The unprecedented pace forced the dockyard to stockpile miles of steel plating and structural framing well before the keel was officially laid, allowing the hull to rise with unnatural speed. On February 10, 1906, King Edward VII officially launched the hull into the water. As the massive steel form slipped down the slipway, Dreadnought began its historical transformation. It ceased to be merely a singular ship and started the process of becoming a word, a generic noun that would soon define an entire era of global naval supremacy. Following the launch, the frantic phase of fitting out the turbines, armor, and wiring began. Against all conventional industrial logic, on October 3, 1906, just 366 days after her keel was laid, the ship raised steam and departed for her preliminary sea trials. The psychological strike had worked flawlessly. Foreign admiralties were stunned by the speed of British industry, realizing they were suddenly years behind. But a dockyard miracle and a brilliant propaganda campaign meant nothing if the radical new theories failed in the open ocean. The blueprint now had to meet reality. After commissioning that December, Dreadnought embarked on a much longer Mediterranean and Atlantic shakedown. The Parsons steam turbines proved an overwhelming success in sustained ocean service. During the wider program, Dreadnought covered more than 7,000 miles, including a passage of roughly 3,400 miles from Gibraltar to Trinidad at an average speed of more than 17 knots. More importantly, the decks remained remarkably still. The heavy machinery vibration associated with reciprocating engines at high power was dramatically reduced. The gunnery spotters high in the masts finally had the stable, predictable platform they desperately needed to calculate long-range salvos. But the shakedown and later service also exposed the practical costs of other design trade-offs. The next Bellerophon-class ships adopted a heavier 4-inch anti-destroyer battery, while later designs eventually moved to 6-inch secondary guns. The accommodation reversal remained deeply unpopular. Several later designs retained versions of it, but the Royal Navy eventually abandoned the experiment and restored more traditional patterns. As the years passed, the warship that was supposed to dominate the seas found herself rapidly overshadowed by her own successors. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Dreadnought's awkward gun layout, 12-inch battery, and earlier protection scheme had been surpassed by the massive super dreadnoughts she had inspired, even though her nominal speed remained broadly comparable to many battleships in the fleet. She served as flagship of the Grand Fleet's 4th Battle Squadron, but she would secure one confirmed combat victory in the most ironic manner possible. On March 18, 1915, in the North Sea, the German submarine U-29 fired a torpedo at HMS Neptune and then broke the surface near the British battle line. Dreadnought sighted the submarine, turned out of formation, and accelerated toward her. Instead of using the long-range artillery for which she had been built, the battleship rammed U-29 and sent her to the bottom. It remains the only confirmed case of a battleship deliberately ramming and sinking a submarine. HMS Dreadnought nevertheless faded into the background of a war she had fundamentally shaped. But her greatest impact was never going to be on the battlefield. It was the devastating effect she had on the global balance of power. When the true capabilities of HMS Dreadnought were finally understood by the world, Admiral Lord Charles Beresford's terrifying warning became reality. Across the North Sea, the German Admiralty, guided by Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, recognized instantly that their entire fleet of mixed-battery battleships was now strategically outclassed. Dreadnought's arrival created a retrospective category for older mixed battery ships, the pre-Dreadnought, while giving Tirpitz an opportunity to redirect future battleship spending toward the new standard, within the limits imposed by German law, dock capacity, and national resources. The result was one of the most intense and politically consequential naval arms races in modern history. The Anglo-German Dreadnought race consumed immense resources, inflamed public suspicion, and deepened the hostility between London and Berlin. It became one important aggravating factor within the far wider system of alliances, continental rivalries, and crises that led Europe into the First World War. Fisher promoted concentration of fighting power and presented naval reform as a path to greater efficiency. Whatever savings one revolutionary battleship might promise in theory were overwhelmed when the arms race compelled Britain to lay down dozens of successors merely to maintain its lead over the expanding German fleet. Fisher had gambled that British industry could simply outpace the Germans in the new era. He was right about British industrial capacity, but he profoundly underestimated the German willingness to match his wager. Its name became the generic label for the all-big gun, turbine-driven battleships that nations from the United States to Japan rushed to build. Because Dreadnought had proven that steam turbines and uniform heavy guns worked, global naval architecture accelerated at a blinding speed. Within 4 years of Dreadnought's launch, British shipyards were launching 13.5-inch gunned super dreadnoughts, with far more efficient centerline and superfiring arrangements. By 1913, little more than 7 years after Dreadnought entered the water, the first British battleships armed with 15-inch guns were following them down the slipways. Dreadnought was paid off in August 1918, 3 months before the armistice. In February 1919, she returned in a reduced role as a tender and parent ship for vessels of the reserve fleet. In 1921, an Admiralty that could no longer afford to maintain outdated Leviathans sold her for scrap. By 1923, in a bleak breaker's yard in Inverkeithing, Scotland, workers with cutting torches methodically tore apart the steel of her hull. Jacky Fisher had won his argument, and his tightly directed Committee on Designs had helped turn an extraordinarily demanding requirement into steel. By the time that steel was gone, the standard it had imposed had already remade the world's battle fleets.